Like I said, Portia is busy doing her PhD through Stellenbosch and through University in Germany. And I'm very excited about what she's done, and she's come, you'll see from the work she's done, I think you're going to find it very exciting. All right, Portia, over to you.
So it's quite a huge benchmark, but I'll try my best to excite you guys. So I'm not only standing here as a trace and save researcher, I'm also standing here as a spokesperson for the United Organization of Organisms, otherwise known as OO. So I've been briefed by the committee that I need to hold you guys hostage here until there's an agreement amongst all of us that we're going to start treating the organisms better so that they can also benefit you. Otherwise, there'll be a huge riot. All right. So the topic that you see there on the slide is a bit different from what you have there on your workbook. However, I guarantee you that it includes all of that soil regenerative information and more. So basically, I'm going to be talking about building your farm resilience using soil biology. And Graham has set a very nice foundation for me to continue from. And I can't emphasize more on what he said, but I think there'll be some really interesting results that you're going to see here today, which are based on data that has been collected in this area and the cradle areas to try and formulate a story of how our soil is functioning. So the basis of my presentation is going to be broken into 3 parts, whereby I'll be giving you information about the concepts and the principles that we've used and followed in order to arrive at results that we've seen. And then I'll also show you some evidence which we've gathered through our database and our statistical analysis to find out what are the connections between these organisms and the resultant growth that we get. And then finally close off with an action plan that you can implement on your farm to start off being on the road towards building and regenerating our soils. So my main focus is on the living section of the soil. So the living section of the soil is composed of the living organisms, which are your bacteria, your fungi, your protozoa, your plant roots that are still alive. And then we've got the dead organisms, which are your roots that have died and are decomposing. Some microorganisms that are also dead, which are being fed on by other organisms. And then the two of these, the living organisms and the dead organisms, they form part of your battery, which is the humus. So this is the section that you want to also help improve, because this is your lifeline. So when load shedding happens in the ground, you'll have your battery there to sustain you. Okay. So in the soil, it takes a village for it to function. 90% of all our soil functions are mediated by microorganisms. And these microorganisms are dependent on plants in order for them to function. So the way in which we manage our plants will definitely have an impact on the microorganisms that are creating these functions, like improving the storage of water, improving your nutrient holding capacity of that soil, and facilitating mineralization processes. So we are standing here above ground as the people that have got control of what's going on below ground. If we mess up the ground on top, then we're definitely going to mess up what's going on below ground. And we've seen that with the evidence which we have collected. So getting into more details of how the microorganisms actually facilitate this process of nutrient release. I'm going to make an example referring to something which you're all familiar with in terms of energy utilization for your cow. So you always try to make sure that she gets the correct amount of energy, protein, so that she can give you high amounts of milk. The same applies in the soil. Each microorganism has got a certain requirement of energy, which is your carbon in this case, and have got a certain requirement of nitrogen in order to sustain it's living and continue to do the mineralization processes in the soil. So each one of them obviously have got a different requirement because of the different sizes that they have. So for instance, here we've got bacteria, which has got a bodily requirement of carbon to nitrogen of 5:1. Fungi have got a much higher requirement of 20:1 unit of nitrogen. Protozoa and nematodes have got a much bigger requirement. So what happens in the village of soil is that you get the protozoa that has got a higher requirement of carbon and 1 unit of nitrogen. They will feed on the bacteria, so they need about 6 bacteria to satisfy their nourishment. So whatever is left extra in terms of nitrogen, they don't need. You see, microorganisms are not greedy. They only take what they need and they leave the rest for the plant. So all of that extra 5 units of nitrogen, which the protozoa doesn't need, is going to release out into the soil to be taken up by the plant. A similar story is portrayed here by the nematode feeding on fungi, whereby it will feed on 5 fungi and then satisfy its requirement and release units of nitrogen which it doesn't need back into the soil. So essentially, this is how mineralization of nitrogen and other nutrients also occur in the soil. So if you only have bacteria, who's going to eat the bacteria to release that nitrogen? It's locked, it's not available. Unless you bring in the guys that actually feed on the bacteria. That's where your potential lies. Now, moving on to just giving a description of what the soil food web actually entails and what it does. So the bacteria, I look at it more as a nitrogen factory because it's more abundant in the soil. There's billions of nitrogen, of bacterial cells that we have in the soil. Is the most abundant out of all those organisms that I've listed there. So that nitrogen that's within the bacterial bodies is not available until it is fed on. And my favorite, fungi. I call them the polymath because they can do all of the things that these organisms can do and more. And I'll show you evidence much later on of how the fungi is actually the answer to most of our questions that we have in terms of improving our productivity. So that's why I've called it the polymath thing. So in the soil, obviously, we don't want to see an overgrowth and a population of one organism over the other. So that's why we've got population regulators, which are your protozoa and your nematodes. And then we've got the arthropods, which actually break down your more complex organic material, like your dead plant leaves and other dead animals in the soil. So they break them down into smaller units which can be consumed by the other guys up in, which are listed here. And the earthworms, of course, we all know earthworms, how they can burrow and create beautiful channels in the soil that are going to be used by water, that are going to be used by the roots, and provide oxygen also for the organisms that are in the soil. So this picture here depicts a typical root of a plant, and how the root actually takes on those nutrients is that it can only take what's within its root zone. Otherwise, all these nutrients that are outside of its reach, the plant has got no access to it. So how do we maximize the capability of our roots to be able to take on the nutrients that are even without, that are even out of their root zone? This is where fungi comes in. So these little webs that you see here that are interconnected onto these roots, they've got brilliant relationship with the roots. They are called your fungal hypha, and they attach themselves, as you can see here, to the plant roots. And they've got an agreement that you give me sugars, I'll go fetch nutrients and water for you. And they can scavenge the deepest layers of the soil. So if you've got fungi growing actively on your soil and your neighbor doesn't have, you can actually benefit from his irrigation water because your fungi can go and fetch it. So you'll just sit back and relax and let the guy next door irrigate and throw down all of those nutrients and just let the fungi go and fetch it for you. So that's why we need these connections to be there on our soil system, so that we can be able to go and fetch what we've lost with the nutrients that we have put into our systems. Craig showed how much nutrients that we're bringing into the system and how we're utilizing so little of it. And we're losing those nutrients, they're leaching down into deeper layers of the soil which we can't access. The fungi is the answer to that. It's going to go and fetch them for the plant root and improve your production potential of the soil. Now, this is just photo that I took while we were busy doing an analysis in the lab. We were actually doing a different test, and then we noticed that our plates, which we had put soil in them, were starting to grow fungi, which is actually good. The soil is down in Natal, not here in the Tsitsikama. So that's just another close-up of the fungi that grew on our petri dish. So this is what we want to see, even below ground in the soil. We don't want to see this growing only in our lab. And there was no inoculation or whatsoever of any fungi in that sample. So that means whatever grew there, it's what was already in the soil and it became active. So our soils do definitely have the potential of growing fungi. We just are not managing it right for it to grow. So moving on to the evidence which we've collected over the years through our database. From feed that we feed in our camps, and it's drowning in nitrogen. So how do we expect these organisms to be able to thrive? We're still continuing to put down more fertilizer into our system, which is unnecessary, where we should be looking at improving the potential of making the one that's in the soil more available for your plant. And another interesting correlation that we found was that the more of this mold that you grow in your soil, the more nitrogen mineralization occurs. Of course, the theory makes sense, which I showed you earlier, that your fungi will feed on certain organisms, and then whatever is extra that it doesn't need, it's going to release back into the soil. That is also showed by the data. And I think Graham also touched on it earlier on when he said that fertilizer has got a negative impact on your soil organisms. And this is local data that we found, and the same seems to be true irrespective of where you are in the world. So the principles are applicable wherever you are in the world. So the other interesting correlations that we noticed was that both mold and yeast, they actually have got a positive relationship with water holding capacity of soils. So the more of these you have in your soil, the more water you get to hold. A similar story was noticed with the aggregate stability. So these organisms here also help with aggregation of your soil. Okay, so I've taken a farm's data just to look on average what the response to these soil indicators has been like and what is the profiling of that farm. So the farm basically 2017 had about just over 3% nitrogen, carbon, and it actually decreased in 2018. And the active carbon, which is the readily available form of food for the microorganisms, also decreased. And it's shown on my previous slide to be strongly correlated with carbon. So if you have decrease in carbon, it's expected to see that the active carbon is also going to decrease. The CN ratio in 2017 was a lot better than what we see in 2018, which was 6. So the thing about the CN ratio, I'd like to just touch a bit on this, is that you need to have a balance of carbon and nitrogen in your soil that is inclusive of all the organisms that are there. So research has found that that ratio, which is inclusive, is around 24:1. So if you have a lower ratio of CN in your soil, then you are not including all organisms. You are selecting only for those organisms that have got a lower CN ratio requirement in their bodies, such as bacteria. Whereas if you've got a much higher, I'm not saying this one is there, but at least it's better than the 6 that we saw in 2018. It's including all the other organisms that have got a much higher requirement of carbon. So this is the test on fungi balance on the soils for 2017 and 2018. And the blue bar indicates the yeast growth, and the red bar indicates the mold growth. So the most important thing when we are observing these microorganisms in the soil is that we want the count, the combined count of the two, to be at least 10,000 at the minimum. However, more important than the actual count is the balance of these two. So in 2018, it might appear that there's about 25,000 combined counts of these organisms in the soil. However, if you look at the balance, it's way off. It's less than 1. And we don't want this situation because actually the yeasts, they mimic the growth of bacteria in your soil. So this is a huge indicator for us that tells us that this system is actually bacterial dominated. Whereas in 2017, although the count is not so high, what we'd like to have seen here is a sustained ratio and the growth of this growing in this trend that we see here, because the ratio here is at least around 1 point something. So the ideal ratio that we want to see between mold and yeast is 3. So even in this year also, although the counts were not there, but the balance was maintained, which I want to emphasize that it's the most important in your soil. In terms of total nitrogen on this farm, it doesn't come to me as a surprise that we've seen a spike in the growth of yeast, which tells us that bacteria have also grown, considering that there's very, very high amounts of total nitrogen in the soil. This is almost 8 tons of nitrogen that are available per hectare, whereas in 2017, there wasn't a lot of, it's half the amount that we saw in 2018. So the nitrogens, again, I want to emphasize that it is the biggest controller of how your balance is going to be maintained in your soil. And then if we look at how mineralization occurred on that farm through the 2 consecutive years, combined with the nitrogen that was applied on that farm, we see that in 2018, mineralization was occurring. And I would like to, 2017 rather, and I'd like to refer to this mineralization more because it was happening during the time where there was balance of fungi, of mold and yeast, and therefore we can make assumptions that the microbial balance was also being built up. But in 2018, although there was mineralization, however, I wouldn't read much on that mineralization because it's not sustainable. It can crash any moment. And we want to build systems whereby mineralization occurs in a sustainable manner, not just a spike for one moment and then it drops again. So the equivalent of this nitrogen that is supplied through mineralization is equals to that in terms of rands. So if you can save on fertilizer that you apply and rely on organisms to make the nitrogen for the plant, this is how much you'd be saving, more or less. So I took one camp out of that farm's data set, which appeared to be showing all the positive indicators in terms of the balance in life, carbon that's available, and the yeast and the mold ratio. So if you can just look at this table here, this is one camp. It's showing that the carbon is at 2.5. The total nitrogen on that camp is it's 2.5 tons, which is not a lot. And the microorganisms can survive in that environment. And then the active carbon also is quite high, and the balance of yeast and mold is sitting at around 2.7, which is a camp which we would group, as indicated by Craig earlier, as a camp that is ready to work for you. Because it's mineralizing, I'm happy with that mineralization rate, but I believe that it could improve if we improve on our ratio, and we still need to improve on that carbon. So this is a potential camp that a farmer can be able to say, okay, let me challenge myself here in terms of fertilizer application and gradually reduce it, and let the soil sustain that process for me of applying nitrogen. So moving on to the action plan now. I'm going to refer again to this diagram that was shown by Craig earlier, that we should never treat camps on the farm the same way. when we go to a doctor, we don't get administered standard medicine for everyone. There is a diagnosis for yourself, and then you get administered medicine according to your sickness. Why are we doing this now in the soil, whereby we're giving same amounts of nitrogen fertilizer, same amount of management, same type of management rather, whereas the camps are not in the same state? So you need to isolate your camps and look at them individually and see and identify where are the weaknesses, where is the area of improvement for me there. And then also attached to the life that you need to assess on your soil is the fertility, which is also very much dependent on the soil life that you have, and the structure as well as the legume composition on your pasture. So the basic steps for you to getting your camps into an area, into a place whereby you see them working for you, is making sure that you maximize roots in your soil. Because roots, remember, they are the food for the organisms which facilitate all of these soil functions. You have to minimize soil disturbance. Craig, I know you mentioned earlier that we don't see much of this anymore. However, there's an area which I won't mention by name, which every time I drive past through it, I literally cringe because I see the soil naked. The soil is not supposed to be bare. And if there's any one of you that are still tilling your soil, then just don't talk to me today. And then one of the things that we need to make sure that we maximize diversity above ground is indicative of diversity that's occurring below ground. So if you've got diverse pastures, you will certainly have diverse organisms in your soil. So if you're still a single species guy, shame on you, you are missing out on a lot. And of course, fertilizer, I think throughout today we've seen enough evidence that shows us the negative impact of fertilizer on our organisms and how we are inefficiently utilizing it. And I would like to make this point clear that we are not saying nitrogen is not important for the plant. We are actually hammering you on the type of nitrogen that you choose to use for your plant. And the other type, which is your fertilizer, is expensive and it's disturbing the soil processes that make the free nitrogen available. So just to touch on again on what has been spoken earlier about how we need to look at a soil as managing it as a soil health system, whereby we take into account our soil life, looking at all of these indicators that we measure in our laboratory to get an idea of where the life is. And we look at also the soil fertility to understand what are the deficient minerals that we need to improve in our soils. We also look at the soil structure. And these three properties of the soil are what you should take into account in order to know what the health status of your soil is. The SWAN system, which was spoken about earlier by Philip. I know I spoke about soils a lot today, but they are part of a much bigger story because they work in unison with water management. They control and work in unison with our emissions that happen into the atmosphere. The nutrients also that we bring into our systems, they also have got an impact there on the soil. As it is delineated here on this diagram, that every single action that we do on our farm is interconnected. And the way that we can measure those interconnections is at looking at soil, looking at water, looking at the atmosphere and nutrients, because all of these are interconnected. You cannot manage them isolated because they influence each other. With that, I thank you.
Any questions?
I just wanted to know that one case study between 2017 and 2018.